We're told Theranos was founded to make blood testing cheap and accessible for everyone. That story is half the truth. Behind the rhetoric was a young founder who learned to sell conviction as a technology. In 2003 AD, Elizabeth Holmes left Stanford and launched a promise that sounded like a public service. But the promise quickly became a performance. This chapter sets the stage: investors, icons, and a glossy vision that moved faster than the engineering. Elizabeth's black turtlenecks, the whisper network of Silicon Valley, and a boardroom full of powerful names created a halo effect. That halo would buy time and silence for years. We'll move chronologically from the laboratory's early days to the moment the first doubts arrived. Along the way, we'll meet patients, executives, whistleblowers, and journalists who punctured the myth. The question this series asks is simple: was Theranos a miracle built on genius, or a house of mirrors built on narrative? Answering that requires looking at the tech, the deals, and the decisions that turned ambition into one of Silicon Valley's starkest lessons. Pay attention to the human choices, because they explain how the illusion persisted. In 2003 AD, a 19-year-old Elizabeth Holmes left Stanford and started a company with a radical promise. She said a tiny drop of blood could replace vials drawn from patients' arms. The pitch was simple and cinematic: blood testing that was fast, cheap, and comfortable. Silicon Valley loves simple and cinematic. Holmes's charisma and narrative skill opened doors to early funding and mentorship. Early investors included seasoned venture capitalists and some household names who saw both potential and an inspiring story. The technology claimed was equally alluring: a compact machine that could run dozens of clinical assays on a single fingerstick, a portable lab the size of a shoebox. In plain terms, Theranos said it would squeeze months of hospital testing into a moment, much like compressing a feature film into a short clip. But early prototypes were far from finished. Small labs run by Theranos struggled with reproducibility and variability, yet the company continued to sign agreements and recruit talent while the technology was still in flux. That gap between promise and working engineering would become the central fault line in Theranos' history. By 2009 AD, Theranos had matured from a campus project into a company with serious fundraising momentum. The narrative shifted from prototype to product, even as internal engineers raised technical concerns. Theranos claimed its proprietary machines could run a wide panel of clinical tests using minute blood samples. In reality, independent lab validations and later reporting showed many of those tests were run on conventional analyzers purchased from established equipment makers. Think of it as promising a new engine and quietly borrowing engines from other cars behind the garage. The company's allure accelerated when it attracted a stellar board populated by former secretaries of state, retired generals, and industry luminaries. That board gave Theranos institutional credibility that reduced scrutiny. By 2014 AD, Theranos was valued at about $9 billion, making Elizabeth one of Silicon Valley's most celebrated founders. But underneath the valuation, engineers were still wrestling with blood volume, dilution issues, and assay sensitivity. The breakthrough that investors bought was often a narrative, not a fully validated technology. That distinction would become damning when independent testing and patient results began to diverge. Theranos didn't fail only because the science was hard. It failed because of a set of strategic choices that protected narrative over validation. Inside the company, a culture of secrecy and intimidation took root. Engineers who raised alarms were marginalized or pushed out. Managers prioritized tight control of information and strict non-disclosure agreements. Externally, the company pursued fast partnerships with retail giants to scale before clinical validation was complete. The deal with Walgreens in 2013 AD is a classic example. Walgreens wanted a revolutionary health offering. Theranos wanted credibility and distribution. The partnership launched wellness centers that offered Theranos testing in stores. But when tests from Theranos' proprietary devices didn't match results from standard lab analyzers, patient care and trust were at stake. The strategic error was simple to describe: scale the promise before proving the product. That inversion is the opposite of classic Silicon Valley advice to iterate quickly on non-medical products. Medicine requires validation first, scale second. Theranos treated it like a consumer beta test, and that choice accelerated the company toward crisis. The turning point came in 2015 AD, when investigative reporting began to peel back the company's layers. A few brave lab scientists and employees went outside Theranos and became whistleblowers. Their claims sounded technical at first: inconsistent assay results, diluted blood samples, and reliance on commercial machinery disguised as in-house innovation. But those details translated into real-world harms, misdiagnoses, unnecessary anxiety, and compromised clinical decisions. The Wall Street Journal's reporting, led by John Carreyrou, connected the dots and forced public scrutiny. The article exposed how many tests touted as run on Theranos machines were actually performed on third-party analyzers. The cascade that followed was rapid. Regulators, partners, and investors all began to ask pointed questions. For the first time, legal and clinical frameworks entered the previously guarded world of Theranos. The lesson here is about incentives. When narrative and valuation reward secrecy, those inside the organization may hide bad data rather than fix it. Whistleblowers and persistent journalism broke that loop. They shifted the story from Silicon Valley myth-making to patient safety and regulatory compliance. After the reporting, regulatory bodies moved in. In 2016 AD, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, inspected Theranos' lab and found significant deficiencies. The agency revoked the company's Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment certificate for its main laboratory and limited its ability to operate. Walgreens suspended its testing program. Lawsuits multiplied from patients and former partners. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened inquiries that culminated in formal enforcement actions later. In 2018 AD, Theranos announced it would dissolve and return funds to investors as legal exposures mounted. The company's spectacular evaporation was a business implosion that also raised moral questions about accountability at the highest levels. Investors lost billions, employees lost jobs, and patients lost trust. The collapse was not a sudden lightning strike, but the end of a slow burn where regulatory rigor and clinical validation finally caught up to unchecked narrative. As the company unraveled, questions about governance, board oversight, and risk assessment became central to the retrospective analysis. Legal reckoning followed corporate collapse. Federal authorities pursued criminal charges alleging fraud against senior executives. In 2018 AD, both civil and criminal investigations intensified. Elizabeth Holmes was charged with wire fraud and conspiracy for allegedly misleading investors and patients about the capabilities of Theranos technology. These legal actions moved through courts over several years. In January 2022 AD, a jury found Holmes guilty on multiple counts related to defrauding investors. Later that year, she received a prison sentence. Criminal proceedings against other executives, including the former president, also played out with convictions and sentences that illustrated how responsibility moved beyond a single charismatic leader. The legal cases emphasized evidence, email exchanges, lab reports, and witness testimony, rather than rumor. They also forced a public accounting of how corporate governance and investor due diligence failed to catch systemic problems. The trials closed a chapter on the company, but the broader debate about startup culture and oversight only intensified thereafter. Theranos' fall left deep marks across Silicon Valley, biotech, and regulatory communities. The biggest lesson is about discipline. Medical technology requires rigorous validation before scaling. Startups can move fast in software because errors can often be patched. In medicine, a bad rollout can hurt or kill patients. Investors learn to ask more clinical questions and demand third-party validation rather than rely solely on charisma and milestone PR. Boards and regulators tightened oversight for diagnostic startups, and journalists felt validated for calling out potentially dangerous narratives. Philosophically, Theranos is a mirror for what happens when ambition outruns accountability. The company's story nudged a cultural rethink about hype, hero worship, and the limits of the founder as celebrity model. For entrepreneurs, the takeaway is not to fear big dreams, but to pair those dreams with reproducible science, transparent data, and governance that can handle bad news. The true legacy is uncomfortable, a reminder that technology's promise needs humility, and that patience, above valuations, must remain the North Star.
I hope this deep dive gave you a new perspective on the strategies and the relentless mindset behind these global icons. If you enjoy deconstructing business empires and tech legends in this Tech Archive style, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. That way, you will never miss a new blueprint of history. For those of you ready to explore more boardroom coups and technological breakthroughs, I have handpicked 2 videos for you right here on the screen. Click one to keep watching. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.